Poor man went to dance with the paralyzed woman, not knowing she was a millionaire. Curtis wasn't the type of man who walked into parties like that one, but on that Saturday night he was there, not as a guest, never as a guest, but as just another invisible worker, one of those who move between tables with trays, who open doors without anyone looking at their faces. The Oakwood Country Club ballroom was enormous, lit by those soft golden lights that seemed to make everyone look more beautiful, and the live music filled the air with a warm sound that Curtis couldn't ignore, even though he wanted to stay focused on the job. He had been hired that week by Elite Gala Productions to help with the party logistics. It was the work that came up: set up, carry, help organize. The same old brown uniform, the cap on his head, his calloused hands from so much work. Curtis was 38 years old and had a life that hadn't been easy to carry. Not that he complained, that wasn't his way. But there was a certain melancholy in standing at the edge of a dance floor, watching couples who had never had to worry about the month's rent. That's when he saw her. She was in a side corner of the ballroom, far from the main tables, a bit removed from the bustle, seated in her wheelchair in that red dress that caught your eye from across the room, her blonde hair falling slightly to one side, pearl earrings catching the reflection of the lights. She looked at the dance floor with an expression that Curtis couldn't quite define at first. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a longing for something she might never have had. Curtis looked at her for about 3 seconds. Then he looked away. He had work to do. But when he returned to that side of the ballroom about 20 minutes later, she was still in the same spot, same position, same expression, her hand resting quietly in her lap. And the dance floor was full, everyone spinning, laughing, hugging each other, and she was there on the outside of all that, as if there were an invisible glass separating her world from everyone else's. Curtis stopped. It wasn't a well-thought-out decision. It never was with him. It was something that came from the gut, an impulse that sometimes got him into situations he couldn't quite explain later. He approached slowly, without haste, slightly leaning his body so as not to seem like he was invading her space. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, in a voice that came out lower than he intended. "Would you like to dance?" She turned her head, and her eyes met his with an expression that Curtis could only describe later as pure astonishment. It wasn't the offended kind of shock. It wasn't discomfort. It was real surprise, as if that question was the last thing she expected to hear that night. Her name was Meredith. Meredith Sterling. 36 years old. 6 years. And she was looking at that man in the brown uniform, cap on his head and big hands, trying to figure out if he was being serious. "Dance," she repeated. "If you want to. I'm not a good dancer, fair warning, but the music's too good to just stand still." She was silent for a moment, and then very slowly she smiled. Curtis didn't know anything about Meredith at that moment. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know what she did. He didn't know that the red dress she wore had cost more than he earned in 3 months of work. He didn't know that the club where he was working was partly owned by her family. He didn't know anything. And so he simply crouched in front of the chair, gently took her hands, and began to sway to the rhythm of the music. Slowly, without any abruptness, like someone who understands that another person's body has its limits, and that limits are meant to be respected. Meredith was quiet for a few seconds. Then she closed her fingers around his hands. At that moment, I had to read twice. Because there's something very simple about him that's almost impossible to explain. That man didn't ask if she could do it, didn't make a pitying face, didn't hesitate. He just asked if she wanted to. They stayed like that for almost the whole song, him gently swaying, her following along with whatever she could move, the two of them in the corner of the ballroom while the rest of the world spun around them. And when the music ended, Meredith said something Curtis never forgot. "It's been a long time since anyone saw me." He didn't quite understand the phrase at the time. It stuck in his head for the rest of the night as he kept working, carrying boxes, dismantling the sound equipment after the last guests had left. "It's been a long time since anyone saw me." What did she mean by that? Meredith Sterling was the youngest daughter of a family that had built a fortune over decades in real estate development in the Hamptons. Her father had passed away years ago, before she had the chance to show him what she was capable of. Her mother, Eleanor, was a 72-year-old woman who ran the family business with an iron fist and a firm belief that she knew better than everyone what was good for each of them. Meredith's accident had happened when she was 28. A fall, during a work trip, on a wet hallway in a hotel where she was staying to close an important contract. No one had predicted it. No one could have predicted it. Overnight, she who was the daughter who walked through the world with confident, steady strides, who never stopped, who had a full schedule and a firm voice in any meeting, came to depend on a wheelchair, on help. On adaptations, the family made sure to provide with all the efficiency their money could buy. What the money couldn't provide was the way people started looking at her. It wasn't cruelty. It was something worse than cruelty, because at least cruelty requires you to see the other person. It was a kind of polite invisibility, where everyone treated Meredith with kindness, but the kindness of someone talking to a child or someone who won't quite understand. Questions started being asked to her assistant instead of her. Business decisions started being made by her older brother, Preston, who was 44 and had the easy arrogance of someone who knows their inheritance is guaranteed. Her own mother, with the best intentions, had created around Meredith a protected, controlled world where everything was in its place and nothing deviated from the script, which included the club parties. Meredith was taken every now and then so she wouldn't stay home to socialize, as Eleanor would say, but socializing there meant sitting in some strategic corner while people came to her with short, polite sentences before rushing off. No one asked her to dance, not even as a joke. Curtis knew none of this when he left the party that early morning, with the day's dollars in his pocket and exhaustion in his body. He only knew that that woman in the red dress had held his hand in a way that seemed like she was holding on to something. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. That really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The problem started 3 days later, when Curtis went back to the club to return a piece of equipment that had been left behind in the company truck. It was early, the ballroom was nearly empty, and he was passing through the reception when he heard a voice he recognized. Not Meredith's voice. The voice of an older woman, firm, one that ended sentences like someone stamping a document. I need you to confirm that the renewal contract will be signed this week, Meredith. Preston is waiting. I know Preston is waiting, but I need to review the clauses before I sign anything. You always have something to review. In the meantime, the business is at a standstill. Curtis stopped in the hallway without meaning to. He looked through the crack of the slightly open door and saw Meredith sitting in front of a table covered in scattered papers, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and beside her, an older woman with neatly combed white hair, impeccable clothing, the posture of someone who never gave up having the last word. Eleanor, Meredith replied with a calm that seemed cultivated over years of practice. Mum, I'm as much a partner in this business as Preston. I'll sign when I understand what I'm signing. Curtis slowly backed away, dropped off the equipment at the reception and left. But the scene stayed with him. The woman in the red dress who had smiled at him on the dance floor existed in a world much more complicated than he had imagined. What he didn't expect was that he would see her again. It happened a week later, on a Thursday afternoon, when Curtis was making a delivery to a gated community, and the resident who came to sign the receipt was Meredith's assistant, Martha, a friendly woman in her 50s who lived in an apartment within the same gated community where the Sterling family had a set of commercial spaces. Martha recognized him before he recognized her. You're the man who danced with Meredith at the party, aren't you? Curtis stared at her. Did I do something wrong? He asked, because it was the first thing that came to mind. Martha let out a small laugh. Quite the opposite. She talked about you all week. That was true. Meredith had mentioned the episode to Martha with a lightness that Martha hadn't seen in her boss in a long time. It hadn't been a big deal to the world, but for Meredith it was different. Someone had approached her without needing a reason, without owing anything, without being instructed to be kind. It had been spontaneous, and spontaneity was something that Meredith's world had stopped offering a long time ago. She wanted to know if you were going back to the country club, Martha said, with the manner of someone delivering a message that wasn't directly requested but was clearly implied somewhere. Curtis was quiet. Then he said he'd think about it. He thought for about 3 days, And the following Saturday, at the time he knew the club was open for events, he showed up. No work uniform this time. With the nicest shirt he had in his closet, clean shoes, the same cap, because it was the only way he knew how to exist in the world. Meredith was there. This time, she wasn't in the corner. She was near a table talking to a younger woman Curtis didn't know. When she saw him, the conversation stopped. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come back," she said. "I almost didn't," he replied, with the honesty that was his trademark. They talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon. Curtis said he had lived in a small town in the Midwest for 7 years, that he had come to Chicago looking for better work, that his father had been a carpenter and he had learned the trade, but that customers were dwindling over time, and so the way to go was to diversify. He spoke simply, without shame, like someone who knows who they are. Meredith listened to everything. And then she told him about the accident, the rehabilitation time, the family business, and how she was still an active partner, even though some people around her needed to be reminded of that regularly. She told it in the same straightforward tone of someone who has passed the point of filtering their own story. When Curtis left that afternoon, he had her cell phone number in his pocket, and a confusion in his head that he wasn't quite sure what to do with, because it wasn't just the difference in worlds that bothered him, it was that he had truly enjoyed talking to her. He liked the way she spoke, the way she laughed, the way she looked at him as if she was really listening. And when you start to like someone in a way you didn't expect, the whole world suddenly seems more complicated. There are things you feel and are afraid to name, because naming makes them real, and real can hurt. The following weeks were made of text conversations, quick meetings at the coffee shop near the Oakwood Country Club, talks that started about anything and ended late. Curtis learned that Meredith had a business sense that impressed anyone patient enough to listen, that she read a lot, that she had a dry sense of humor that showed up at the most unexpected moments, and that she had a patience with her own body's limits that came from a deep place, earned through effort and time. Meredith learned that Curtis was a man who didn't pretend, that when he didn't know something, he said he didn't know. That when he disagreed with respect but without swallowing what he thought, and that he had a way of being present in conversations that was rare, the kind of person who listens to understand, not just to reply. What the two of them weren't prepared for was the day Eleanor found out. It wasn't a scandal. Eleanor wasn't the type of woman who made scandals. It was worse. She was the type of woman who handled things with efficiency and a coldness that didn't need a loud voice. She called Meredith for a talk on a Sunday morning, with coffee on the table and that smile that meant she had already made a decision before the meeting started. "I heard you've been seeing a young man who works in deliveries." Meredith set her cup down calmly. "His name is Curtis." "I know his name. I also know who he is, where he lives, what he makes." "You had him investigated?" Eleanor didn't seem bothered by the question. "I protect this family. I always have. I'm 36 years old, Mum, and I'm 72, and I know the world has a lot more people interested in other people's money than you imagine." Meredith stared at her mother for a long time. Then she said, in a voice that didn't tremble, "Curtis doesn't know how much money we have. He's never asked, never shown the slightest interest in knowing. The only time the subject came up was when I myself mentioned the business, and he listened because he was listening to me, not because he was looking for something." Eleanor drank her coffee without answering. "I'm not asking for permission," Meredith continued. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know, but the decision is mine." That hung in the air between them like a living thing. The problem was that Meredith didn't know the conversation was about to take a turn she hadn't anticipated, because Preston, her brother, had overheard part of the conversation without meaning to. And Preston had a different way of handling things. Curtis received a strange message the following Monday. It was from a number he didn't recognize, inviting him to a meeting at an office he also didn't know. The message said it was about a job opportunity, no further details. Curtis went because he needed work, and when he arrived at the office and saw Preston sitting on the other side of a huge desk with the expression of someone doing a favor, he still hadn't understood what was happening. "My sister speaks very highly of you," Preston began, with the tone of someone being kinder than necessary. "She's a good person," Curtis replied direct. "She is. She's always been generous, Maybe too generous sometimes. Preston opened a folder on the desk. Look, I'll be honest with you. My family has a financial situation that makes any relationship of Meredith's a delicate matter. It's not personal. It's about protection. Curtis looked at him. Protection from what? From Meredith. And from the interests she represents. Are you offering me money to stay away from her? Preston didn't say yes or no. He pushed the folder a little toward Curtis. I'm offering you a job opportunity in another city. Well paid. You'd start next month. Curtis stared at the folder for about 2 seconds. Then he stood up, grabbed the cap he had placed on the chair, and said just one thing. Tell your sister I'll call her. And he left. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Curtis didn't call right away. He went 2 days without calling, walking around with that thought in his head, letting the anger settle before saying anything. Because he was angry, yes, but not at Meredith. He was angry at feeling small in a situation he hadn't asked to be in, at realizing her world had layers upon layers he hadn't considered when he'd simply approached a woman who seemed alone at a party. What he didn't know was that Meredith was furious too. She found out what Preston had done on a Thursday when Martha, who knew everything because she always knew, told her what she'd heard circulating among the office staff. Meredith asked her brother to come talk to her that same afternoon. The conversation was one of the hardest they'd ever had, and they'd had plenty. You have no right to do this, she said, without beating around the bush. I have an obligation to protect the family's interests. I am the family, and I'm not an interest, I'm a person. Preston sighed with that annoying patience of someone who thinks they're being reasonable. Meredith, you've known this man for less than 2 months. I know. And I already know more about who he is than you'll know in 2 years, because you'll never bother to really look at him. You're being emotional. I'm being clear. There's a difference. She paused, took a breath. Preston, I've spent the last 8 years letting the people around me make decisions for me. Mum, the doctors, the lawyers, you. I let them because I was putting myself back together, because I needed time, because I thought that was the way. But it's not anymore. And Curtis didn't do anything wrong. If you pushed him away, you pushed me away too. Preston was silent for a long moment. Does he know who you are now? He finally asked. No. I never told him the exact amount of what the family has, and he never asked. And when will you tell him? Meredith looked at her brother without looking away. I'll tell him, and I'll find out who he really is from there, but that's my decision, not yours. Curtis called on Friday morning. Meredith answered on the second ring. You know what your brother did, he said. It wasn't a question. I know, and you left the office without picking up the folder. What was I going to pick it up for? She was quiet for a second. Then she said, Can you come here? They met at the same coffee shop as always. Curtis arrived first, ordered 2 coffees, and stared out the window with that expression Meredith had learned to recognize as him organizing his thoughts before speaking. I need to tell you something, she said as soon as she settled at the table. Go ahead. And she told him. About the family, about the businesses, about the scale of what they had inherited and still managed, about the apartment, about the properties, about the board meetings she attended by video when she couldn't go in person. She told him without beating around the bush, without downplaying and without exaggerating, like someone delivering important information and needing to see how it would be received. Curtis listened to everything. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he stared at his coffee for a while. Did you think I'd change towards you when I found out? He asked. I don't know, but I thought you needed to know. Okay. He drank his coffee. And I really did. Why? Because I wanted to know if it would change anything in me. Pause. He hasn't changed. Meredith stared at him. Weren't you scared? She asked. I was. I still am. Curtis set his cup on the table. But fear isn't a good enough reason to walk away from something that feels right. That was the moment, not an elaborate declaration, not a dramatic gesture. A simple sentence from a man who didn't know how to speak beautifully, but knew how to speak the truth. And sometimes truth is all a person needs to hear. What came after wasn't simple. It never is. Eleanor took time to make room for Curtis in the family circle, and he took time to feel whole in an environment that still displaced him sometimes. Preston took even longer, but he did, and in the end it was precisely Curtis's consistency, the way he never changed his stance, never bowed, never tried to impress anyone, that broke down the resistance one by one. Meredith resumed an active role in business decisions, not because she had to fight hard, but because it became clear to everyone that she had been underutilized for years and that her head for business was one of the sharpest in the family. Preston was the first to admit it about 6 months later, in a meeting where her analysis of a new contract saved the family from a considerable loss. Curtis started working with woodworking again. The skill was there, stored away, waiting. He set up a small workshop with what he had saved, cautiously accepted his first clients, and slowly built back something that was his. Meredith followed this process with the same interest he had shown in hers, without condescension, without offering help that wasn't asked for. Eleanor, on a Sunday afternoon many months later, called Curtis to sit with her on the porch of the house. She served coffee. They were silent for a while. Then she said, without looking directly at him, that she had learned over the years to distinguish who looked at Meredith and who looked at the family name, that it took time, that she was still watching. "I know," Curtis replied. "And you don't have a problem with that?" "No. You're her mother. It makes sense." Eleanor was quiet. Then she made a small gesture with her hand that, in 72 years of life, was the closest she came to saying she approved of something. Meredith heard about the conversation later, when Martha told her. She was silent for a long moment. Then she went after Curtis, who was on the porch looking at the garden, his thoughts far away. "What did you and my mother talk about?" she asked. "We had coffee." "Curtis." He turned to her with a half-smile. "She told me she's still watching me. I said I understood. And we had coffee." Pause. "It was a good coffee." Meredith let out a laugh that started small and grew, genuine, the kind of laugh that comes when you're truly light. Curtis watched her laugh as if he were storing that image somewhere important. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. There were days when the differences weighed heavily, when Curtis felt on the outside of a conversation that required a vocabulary he didn't have, when Meredith felt the exhaustion of having to explain to the world that she was whole, that the wheelchair was part of her life and not her whole life. There were days when her brother and mother pulled in different directions, when business got complicated, when the weight of everything seemed more than two ordinary human beings could carry. But there were also those Saturday afternoons when music played somewhere at the Oakwood Country Club, and Curtis would crouch in front of her wheelchair, take her hands carefully, and they would stay there, swaying, without hurry, without an audience, without having to prove anything to anyone. And Meredith thought on those afternoons that there were certain things money had never bought and never would. The way someone chooses to see you when they don't have to. The way someone stays for no reason at all except because they want to. She had spent years invisible, and a man in a brown uniform with a cap on his head, on a party night that wasn't meant for him, had simply asked if she wanted to dance. Sometimes your whole life changes with a simple question from a person who owed nothing to anyone. End of story. The story of Meredith and Curtis made me think about how much time we spend waiting for someone to truly see us. Not the version we show, not the name we carry, not what we have or don't have, the real us. And when that happens in the simplest way, at the least expected moment, it changes everything. Thank you for sticking around until the end. If you want to keep receiving stories like this, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment what you thought. Also, tell me, do you think Curtis did the right thing by staying? I'd love to know what you think. See you in the next story.